Drawing a simple house can feel like a relatively simple drawing subject to do because in lots of ways there are relatively simple shapes, box-like shapes with roofs that are possibly pitched in a triangular way, such as this one here. And yet, if we're not careful, we'll draw our houses with an emphasis on shape, on outline, and end up creating a fairly artificial or even cartoon-like way. What we want to do when we draw a house, as is the case when we draw anything, is to capture the effect of the particular subject that we're looking at, the particular house in this case. Now I'm drawing this with a 0.1 millimeter pen, which is a finer pen than I usually use, but I'm not drawing this very large. And because of the hatching I'm going to need to do for the shadows under the veranda, I don't want my lines to be too thick, because I also don't want to have a heavy outline on this. A lot of the sense of this scene comes from the light effect, comes from the contrast between light and shade. Now I'm drawing directly with pen, so there's no pencil under drawing that I can use and then erase afterwards. So I have to be careful with every mark I place. I start with that second veranda post in because I can see that whole post, and that then becomes my measuring stick for what I then draw around it, to the left, to the right, and you saw me measuring that perspective angle with my pen. What I usually do is I eyeball it first. Sometimes I put a dot where I think the line is going to go to, and then I check that angle against the reference. But what I'm doing at this point is really trying to establish the main lines of the veranda and what we see under the veranda. In some ways, what's not under the veranda in this house is very simple, very straightforward. It's really just the pitched roof. And for that, we do need to pay attention though to those leaves, that tree branch that come in over the top. So I don't want to draw strong lines up there too soon. I need to know where the leaves are. But at this point, I'm just feeling my way now with some rather badly drawn lines for the top of the veranda there. But notice at the end that while they look a bit blotchy and terrible now, they're not going to be nearly so significant at the end of the drawing. And this is always a great lesson to learn in any subject that we draw, that most mistakes, in inverted commas, that we make, most lines that aren't quite right, don't look nearly so wrong by the end of the drawing. So now I'm drawing the outline of this window that's behind there. Now it's a bit tricky this, because the window doesn't stand out too much in this scene because of the shadow that's cast on it. And yet it's a fairly important architectural detail. So we want it to come out to be seen, but we don't want it to be too bold, too strong, too contrasty with the house otherwise. And it's the same, even more so, with this other window that's further along. Now I did do a little quick trial of a corner of this section under the veranda with my hatching, my lines close together that I'm going to use to represent the shadow that's being cast by the veranda. Notice the contrast I've used in my marks with the top of the hedge and the building, and that's very deliberate. I didn't draw a line, even a wriggly line, across the top of the hedge. I drew a series of marks to represent the little irregular bursts of leaf matter that appear and catch the sunlight in front of the shadow behind. Now, this is an old weatherboard house, and I need to define the weatherboards at least a bit, but they're all mostly going to be in shadow, so that's works to my advantage. They don't need to be quite as perfect otherwise. And I'm just redefining some of the vertical lines that define the building because I'm going to put vertical lines in for my hatching on this front wall, I've decided. Now notice how I'm establishing the apex of the roof by seeing what it lines up with underneath. And when I put that dot, if I then measure the angle to the corner and compare it with the angle in my reference, that tells me whether I've got the right height and just whether the other elements of the building are aligning properly. Now, this is a very run-down building, and I could have actually even made more of that in some of the marks I put on. I haven't really put any marks on the front of the roof section there above the veranda to indicate the weathered paint. I probably could have done that. This drawing took me 28 minutes to do in real time. So if you want to see the actual speed I drew this at, use that cog icon you can see and reduce this speed to half speed, and then you'll be able to watch it at actual drawing speed. So it was a relatively fast drawing for the number of lines that were used. So here I am doing the hatching lines. Now, in terms of what direction we do the hatching lines, that's always up to the artist. Whatever you think works best, whatever direction, whether it's straight up and down, whether it's horizontal, whether it's at an angle sloping to the left or to the right. Generally, I like to in some way reflect the shape of the surface that the shadow is on with the direction of my lines. And so I do most of these lines vertically. I do just a very small number of them horizontally. I'm actually being more careful than I normally am with these lines because I don't want to go over my edge on either side of the hatched areas, because the contrast between light and dark is a fairly important part of the overall effect of this photo reference, and therefore I want it to be a fairly significant part of the overall effect of my drawing. And because it is a fairly raggedy old cottage, my lines can be a little raggedy as well, and that will simply help create the feel of this cottage, whose materials are a bit bendy, a bit misshapen, a bit weathered looking. And very important contrast in this drawing is the contrast between the cottage and the building materials of the cottage, and the hedging along the front and the tree above and the path. And so I want to have a contrast between the lines that I mostly use for the house and the marks that I use for most everything else except possibly the branches of the tree that come down from above. I really want to create that contrast because that will make the house look more like a house if the foliage looks more like foliage, if that makes sense. I also tried to be extra careful doing this hatching that I didn't hatch over the white veranda posts. Now, they're an important part of this effect, the contrast between the white and the dark behind, and yet they are relatively thin posts, so I did pay a little more attention than I normally do to that. And I've just realized though that I should have put just a little bit of shadow at the top of each of those posts because of the overhanging veranda casting a bit of shadow at the top. That's really annoying me now, because those are the sorts of details that can really make a drawing snap into a more realistic feel than just what I've drawn there, where it's not necessarily quite so obvious that something's wrong, but if we put that sort of detail in, it really creates the three-dimensional feel. Because what I've done is I've in effect brought those veranda posts right out to the front, whereas if there was that little bit of shadow at the top, that would push them back under the veranda edge just a bit more and would create, therefore, more of a sense of three dimensions at work in the front of the house. But not a problem, I can do it now. It's just that you won't be able to see it. And now I'm doing the shadow that's on the front of the house under the roof section on this front triangular, almost a pediment section. Again, taking those lines fairly carefully. And now at this point, I've really just got the foliage to do. So again, I want to create a really strong sense of contrast. Now, all of this foliage in the front is closer, and therefore, if I use bolder, stronger lines and marks, heavier ink going on the paper, I'm going to bring the things visually that those marks are representing closer, more forward, because things that are closer look clearer and stronger, and things further back look lighter and fainter and in less detail. And so if I represent that effect with the marks I make and the things I draw with those marks, that also helps to create a sense of depth. Now, this overhanging branch is one of the closest things, if not the closest thing, that we're seeing. So therefore, I do want to do nice, strong, clear lines and marks for it. I probably didn't quite finish enough foliage on this left side branch, but you can see how I'm just creating the effect of the leaves. I'm not trying to draw leaves at all. Unless the leaves are really very close, we're better off trying to just create an effect of leaves that at a glance gives us a sense of foliage. The one exception is if there's a silhouette edge, it can be good to try and capture the feel of the individual leaves in that silhouette edge. Now, I'm doing this dark section to the left. It's an important section to do because the contrast between the dark of the shadows in the foliage and also just the dark green of the foliage and the sunlight on the side of the house is quite significant to just define the house, but also to create visual interest. It's always good to have some strong contrasts of light and dark next to each other, particularly in a section such as this side going backwards, which can visually get a bit lost in comparison to the front facade. But otherwise, we're getting pretty close to it being done. Just a few more details now with the front and just finishing off the foliage. I do the shadows on the steps. The other thing, looking at this, that I could have done, I really was trying to keep this under 30 minutes. The other thing I could have done was just had some lines on the top of the veranda to represent the corrugations in the ironwork, in the old ironwork. And those lines would have been coming angled more at me on the left-hand side, but increasingly sloping away from me as they moved across to the right. If you've seen some of my other drawings of houses with corrugated iron sheeting on the roof, you'll know what I mean. But again, not drawing every corrugation, just suggesting the detail. Again, I'm putting some value in some bushes behind here just to highlight that angle of the roof. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope you found this interesting and helpful, and I hope you have a go. I'll put this reference photo on my channel community page. It's a great subject to have a go at capturing the feel, the effect of a house, rather than just drawing the outlines. Even a simple house deserves to look real. So why not give it a go? But look, whatever you draw and however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.